Good morning. How's everyone doing today? All right. Glad to hear everyone's as excited to be here as I am. By way of introduction, I'm Drew Patterson. I'm the executive chairman and co-founder of Transparent. We are building the data source of record for the short-term rental industry. We aggregate pricing, supply, demand data around this category. We productize it, sell it to hotels, to property managers, platforms, to local governments to make better sense of this industry. And obviously, we are huge bulls on the category, and we are incredibly excited to be here at this inaugural Skift Short-Term Rental Conference. Clearly, Rafat knew something was up in the industry, looking at the level of interest that is around this. So this morning, I want to talk about whether or not the astronomical rate of growth in the short-term rental industry can continue. This is a question that we get time and again from our customers. We hear going all around the industry. And I know you've all been waiting with bated breath to hear what a guy like me thinks about this. So, with no further ado, I mean, the full-throated answer we would make is yes. There is enormous room for growth in this category. And the lens that I want to use to talk about it this morning is around industry structure and consolidation. So specifically, I'm going to touch on two themes. First, I want to look at the structure of the short-term rental industry and compare what we see in urban markets versus leisure markets. And then second, we're going to take a look at what we see in the hotel industry and what lessons we might be able to learn against that. And I hope you'll bear with me, because I feel like I'm now going to be illustrating a bunch of the points that Francis was making earlier around the nature of the hotel industry. And unfortunately, I'm going to be doing that with a bunch of data. I don't have pretty pictures of beautiful buildings to show. So I'll ask for your patience and indulgence. But as a geek, we were geeking out putting together these slides. So hopefully you'll enjoy them as well. So to start, as we look at the industry, the leisure and urban markets, we talk about this as being one industry, the short-term rental industry. It actually has two very different characteristics. We see on the one hand leisure markets, which we could think of as places like ski towns, Kissimmee, Park City, beaches like Myrtle Beach or Gulf Shores, markets like Palm Springs. And to caricature them a little bit, these are markets that have emerged well in the past. They tend to be served by property managers that came out of the world of real estate. The average age of property managers in this category is about 16 years old. And it's a market with about 217,000 listings in what we defined as top markets. That is to say, 217,000 listings in markets that have over 500 listings in that market. And then on the other hand, you have what we're describing as urban markets. These are places like where we are today, New York City, Los Angeles, Miami, Austin, Seattle. And these are much younger markets. Again, to caricature them, they came of age around Airbnb. The property managers that serve these markets tend to be much younger. They're about 9 years old on average, based on survey work we've done. And looking at top markets, there are 273,000 listings in these markets. So again, urban markets are today bigger than what we see in leisure markets. And obviously, you all know this, but this category as a whole has been a huge magnet for capital over the past decade. Over the past decade, we've seen nearly $2 billion of capital come into this category. And the majority of that capital, in fact, 50% more, has gone into urban property managers than leisure property managers. I think that's something that comes to be expected by folks here. We've all been reading the same reports from Skift. But one other thing to note here is we see a much wider distribution. So as we look at these urban markets, we see a far greater degree of companies that have been invested in by investors. That said, while there's all this capital that's been going into urban markets, one thing we also see is a slower rate of growth in these urban markets. Looking at listings, we see leisure markets have been growing more quickly than have urban markets over the past 3 years. So how do we make sense of this? Why is so much capital chasing urban supply when they're not growing as quickly as our leisure markets? Well, the thing that we found interesting when we started to unpack the data was looking at market structure. So again, we compared on the left leisure markets and on the right urban markets. What we did is we broke up the supply in these markets based on the size of the property managers serving those markets. We looked at small hosts, those between 1 and 5 listings under management, which you can see in the orange bar at the bottom. Mid-sized hosts, medium-sized hosts, and then large hosts, which are the bar in blue at the top. And actually what you then see is the structure of these markets is quite different. Whereas leisure markets are relatively evenly distributed between VRBO or individual host owners, mid-sized property managers, and large managers, the urban markets tend to be dominated by individual managers. Today, if we look at top markets, the scale property managers, the Saunders, the Stay Alfreds, the folks we'll be seeing here today, represent a very small percentage of total supply. Only 9% of listings come from these large property managers today. Now, of course, when we look at growth, we see a very different story, right? In urban markets, these large property managers have been growing at a furious rate. Over the past 3 years, they've grown at a compounded annual growth rate of 84%. By contrast, small property managers in urban markets have actually been shrinking. So when we step back and say, why is it we're seeing flat to modest growth in urban markets, whereas leisure markets are growing more quickly? What we're seeing this shift is all at the bottom of the curve, right? It's all the individual property managers that are struggling. So how much growth can we expect here? Well, if we take these leisure markets rather as the benchmark that ultimately this industry will converge around, they are more mature markets. We can continue to see today's urban property managers grow at 84% compounded, and it won't be till 2022 when they reach the same relative market share as their leisure market peers. Second, I want to talk about what we can learn from the hotel industry. So the hotel industry obviously has been around for a lot longer. We heard some of Francis's comments earlier about the inspiration that he's taken from that. And I think as we reflect on where this industry might go, there's also lessons that we can learn from how their industry has evolved and where we might see ourselves going. So for starters, I thought it's worth looking at a historical perspective. Again, as we look back in time at the hotel industry, what we think of as hotel brands today, the Marriotts, the Starwoods of the world, once upon a time, they covered the entire spectrum of hotel operations. That is to say, they built brands, which meant developing operating standards, running loyalty programs, attracting consumers, running a sales organization. They also managed their properties, so they would hire staff, they would clean rooms, they would have local sales operations, they would go attract owners. And then finally, there's a real estate component where they would go about finding and investing and developing new properties, this very kind of capital-intensive real estate function. Well, in the mid-90s, the hotels decided this wasn't such a great idea. These are three very different businesses that have very different economies of scale and very different expertises. And so what did they do? They ended up breaking themselves up. And so today, as we look at the hotel industry, we see a bunch of brands that perform these same basic functions, right? They develop operating standards, they build new concepts for brands, they have loyalty programs that customers come to know and love. We see a number of players that are in the management and operations world. These are folks that actually run hotels. They're the ones that hire cleaners and front desk agents and interact with guests all the time. And then finally, we see a set of real estate developers who own and finance and sell and asset manage those properties. Well, looking at these three segments of the industry, they look really different today. If once upon a time this was a relatively homogeneous industry, today the degree of market concentration across these three segments looks very, very different. In the world of branding, the top 10 players in that market control 64% of all rooms in North America. By contrast, management and operations, the top 10 players control only 32% of the rooms in North America. Finally, if we look at the real estate component of the industry, only 8% of supply is concentrated in the top 10 players in the industry. Why is this so? Well, stepping back, it's not, makes some intuitive sense. The kinds of activities involved in branding have enormous returns to scale. Building a loyalty program works better when it's a deeper, richer network. Investing in technology works when you have a larger cost base that you can put that on top of. Building a concept around a brand works better, again, when you have a larger base to put that on top of, and you have more and more franchisees who are willing to pay for that brand. By contrast, real estate is an intensely local activity. The level of insight that you can begin to gain around building a property is a lot harder to do at a global or national scale. Real management and operations has some of those kinds of economies of scale, but less than what we see in branding. So taking this, reflecting on our own experiences in industry, what can we learn? Which of the activities among short-term rental operators today are most aligned with these given categories? Well, I'd make the case that we see a level of activity around branding and management and operations around the players in our category today. But by and large, most of the activities run by short-term rental operators would fall into this world of management and operations. So what does this mean as we begin to look forward and say, what will be the degree of consolidation we can expect in this industry? Well, today, the top 10 players in short-term rentals control just 5% of all supply. If we imagine that short-term rental operators are most like real estate, that is to say an intensely local business that requires a lot of local expertise, well, we're kind of getting to the level of concentration where the real estate part of the hotel industry is today. On the other hand, if we believe that the brands that we're hearing about today will start to take shape and have real power in the market, that we will get to a point where real estate owners are paying not just for management services, but paying for franchisees, that the technologies and platforms and brand concepts that are being developed work not just because Sonder and Stay Alfred and Vacasa and Turnkey and all these players can operate them themselves, but they have a playbook that they can then provide to third parties that they can go run on their own. Well, gosh, then it's likely that we'll see a great degree more concentration than we have right now. And finally, I thought it was worth looking from a historical perspective again of where we stand relative to some of these analogs. So I happen to take. I started my career at Starwood Hotels. I remember when W was launched, and it was this incredibly exciting idea. Burst onto the scene in the late '90s, and you saw it start to take shape. Year one was where W began. In this case, grew nicely, and then you saw again a burst of growth in the mid 2000s as they began to franchise this brand. So again, what's the distinction here? With this brand licensing we're talking about, in the mid-2000s, W went from simply owning and operating and managing their own properties to starting to license that brand to third-party operators. And you saw, again, this huge wave of growth that dramatically accelerated the size of the portfolio. Well, where are we today if we begin mapping this against some of the brands in our category? We see, if we map the same time scale from the year of founding to where we are today, Sonder and Stay Alfred, taking two examples, are beginning to get to some of the same scale where W was when it had the ability to start franchising its brands. Will we see the same growth into the future? To me, it's an interesting question and suggests a promise for where the industry can go. So in conclusion, will growth continue? What do we see as the prospects for this industry? From where we sit, it looks incredibly bullish. On the one hand, we see urban markets supporting a level of consolidation that we have yet to achieve. There's an enormous amount of capital that's going to this category, and yet in urban markets, the industry is controlled by mom-and-pop operators that don't have the level of sophistication or scale that larger property managers do. Second, we see the promise of, in the hotel industry, brands that will allow for far more rapid growth. From where we sit, this looks like a yet unproven proposition. While we're seeing these brands start to emerge and grow quickly, we've yet to see anyone that's been willing to franchise those brands. And it's worth noting, we heard Marriott just a moment ago talk about their approach to the industry. Their approach to this industry looks different than what they've taken from the hotel industry. Rather than beginning to build their own franchises, they're operating as a distribution channel, providing access for third-party brands. So if we can get there, if we can get to the point where brands like the ones that we're going to hear today can start selling their franchises, gosh, there's an awful lot of great things to come. With that, I'll thank you for your time and look forward to talking to you later.